Good morning. This is Garry Glaub in Mooresville, North Carolina. And today we're going to finish Hebrews 11. And this study is called Hall of Faith Part 2. This chapter in Hebrews reminds us that life is not easy. If it were easy, faith would not be nearly as important. For it is our faith that carries us through the difficulties. Faith of Noah carried him along with his family from a world that was being destroyed to a new world with all possibilities remaining. For anyone who ever has desired a fresh start, it was there for Noah and family. Abraham had the faith to take whatever God gave him, and God used that faith and humbleness to begin the descendants of the Jewish nation. The blood of Abraham still exists today in those descendants, though the faith of those descendants is mostly dormant. But God has a plan, and all of that will change, maybe very soon. For each of us who believe, our faith will lead us to a heavenly home. A world without strife, a world without sin, a world without tears. We cannot read these stories of the heroes of faith, members of the Hall of Faith, without understanding that God had a plan in their lives, just as He has a plan in ours. One of our challenges is to walk in faith, as we might be part of God's plan in someone else's life. Okay, let's return to Hebrews 11, and we're going to do verses 23 through 29. By faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents, because they saw he was a beautiful child and they were not afraid of the king's edict. By faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to endure ill treatment with the people of God than to enjoy the temporary pleasures of sin, considering the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures of Egypt. For he was looking to the reward. By faith he left Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he persevered as though seeing him who is unseen. By faith he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of the blood, so that the destroyer of the firstborn would not touch them. By faith they passed through the Red Sea as through dry land, and the Egyptians, when they attempted it, were drowned. Moses had 3 40-year periods in his life, according to Acts 23. Until he was 40, Moses was in the court of Pharaoh and lived as Pharaoh's adopted grandson, as Pharaoh's daughter had adopted Moses as an infant. He became interested in his Jewish roots, and at the time the Jews were slaves in Egypt. At 40, after killing a man, Moses left Pharaoh's court for the wilderness. While in the wilderness, Moses met God, heard God, and his life changed. After 40 years in the wilderness, Moses finished life by leading the children of Israel from Egypt to the Promised Land. There's something special about the wilderness, though it might not seem so when we are in its midst. Symbolically, the wilderness is a place of testing, and is certainly a place of God's provision as well. It also can be a place of discipline. Jesus was tested in the wilderness, and Moses spent 40 years there in preparation for his mighty task to come. We might feel alone when in the wilderness, but God is there with us, just as he appeared to Moses and changed his life. God took Moses on a journey from the world to the wilderness to the walk. Moses willingly left the world, which included wealth and ease, and found himself in the wilderness, where he found God. God prepared him and gave Moses abilities and power he either did not previously have or he didn't know that he had. Moses had a problem with speech and might have stuttered, but God used him to speak to the king of the world of that time. Even though Pharaoh was the grandfather of Moses, he must have been surprised with the change in power and faith of Moses. What Moses learned in the wilderness prepared him for a 40-year walk. leading the seemingly unleadable children of Israel. When Moses died without entering the promised land, God hid the bones of Moses so no one could disturb them, as the archangel Michael and Satan were fighting over the bones. But Moses did reach the ultimate promised land, heaven, and returned to the promised land on earth in the land of Israel at the Mount of Transfiguration during the ministry of Jesus. Moses walked by faith, not by sight. If he had walked by sight, he would have abandoned the unbelieving mass of people. There's something else worth noting here, included in this section. Hebrews 11:25 mentions that Moses chose to follow God's will instead of the temporary pleasures of sin. For most of us, that phrase will resonate. If sin had no pleasure, we would not be drawn to it so strongly. But those pleasures are temporary, if not momentary. I remember teaching a Bible study for a year to 3 young men who were in rehab for various drug addictions. One's drug of choice was heroin, and having no personal experience with drugs, I did not understand its hold on him. He explained that the first time he did heroin, it was the highest high of all time. Subsequently, the next time he did heroin, he only could get back to the highest high with more heroin. And each time he continued to chase that first high. And so the journey continued. Finally, with heroin users, the amount of drug they take will kill them, usually when the body forgets to breathe. Our sin addiction is not much different. The temporary pleasure that comes from sin is never as pleasurable as we remember it to be. If we continue in our addiction to sin, it always leads to death. All right, let's continue in Hebrews 11, and we're going to do verses 30 to 38. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell down after the Israelites had marched around them for 7 days. By faith, the prostitute Rahab did not perish along with those who were disobedient after she had welcomed the spies in peace. And what more shall I say? For time will fail if I tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David and Samuel and the prophets, who by faith conquered kingdoms, performed acts of righteousness, obtained promises, shut the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, from weakness were made strong, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. Women received back their dead by resurrection, and others were tortured, not accepting their release, so that they might obtain a better resurrection. And others experienced mocking and flogging, and further, chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, they were tempted, they were put to death with the sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, tormented, people of whom the world was not worthy, wandering in deserts, on mountains, and sheltering in caves and holes in the ground. So after reading about a murderer in the Hall of Faith, the next hero is a prostitute. Rahab is almost always referred to as Rahab the harlot in the Bible, and it makes me hope that is not her nickname in heaven. Wouldn't it be horrible to be known for the failures in our lives rather than the successes? Especially with that name for all of eternity. Regardless, she made the Hall of Faith, so God is certainly calling attention to what she did for him. Her life certainly changed greatly, and it is not because Rahab went to rehab. Before Joshua fought the Battle of Jericho, Rahab both welcomed the spies and helped them escape. Before God destroyed that walled city, as we all remember, the walls came tumbling down. What is more amazing about Rahab than the fact that she was a prostitute is that she is the great-great-grandmother of King David and is an ancestor of both Mary and Joseph, as she is listed in both genealogies of Luke and Matthew. That tells us more about God than it tells us about Rahab. Instead of choosing ancestors for Jesus of pristine reputations, God even chose a prostitute. This is yet another way that God teaches us about forgiveness. But maybe it also tells us that for mankind, unlike God, forgive and forget is pretty difficult. We honor her in the hall of faith, but still remember she was a prostitute. At least we know that God chooses to forget our sins. Others mentioned here are Gideon, Barak. Yes, at one time there was a godly Barak. Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel, and the prophets. The prophets are mentioned by name here, kind of like the prophets are not mentioned by name here. And it's kind of like the first season of Gilligan's Island when the professor and Mary Ann were just referred to as "and the rest" in the theme song. But if we read the Old Testament, it's very easy to see who those major prophets and minor prophets were, even if not named here. David went from shepherd boy to king to murderer and adulterer, and was also a man after God's own heart. That demonstrates that David understood he was a sinner, and more importantly, understood God's gift of forgiveness. We can see David's heart in his repentance and his walk by faith improved after his failures. And again, we get to see God's own heart in that process as well. He does not choose the perfect, but instead, he picks people he can perfect. Again, that is not because we are sinless, but because God will complete his work in us. So let's finish Hebrews 11, just two more verses. Hebrews 11, 39 through 40. And all these, having gained approval through their faith, did not receive what was promised, because God had provided something better for us, so that apart from us, they would not be made perfect. As believers, God walks with us. In this passage, we are reminded that those walks are not going to be easy. Of all the people named here, King David seems to be the only one to have financial ease. But that did not make David's life so easy either. The people described here included those who were tortured, stoned, sawn in two, along with other descriptive events that marked the lives of these heroes of faith. We live in one of the most prosperous nations on the earth and complain when we are inconvenienced with any hardship. In case we have forgotten, this is not our home. God created a perfect world for perfect people, but our sin changed all of that. Since that time, God gave Satan dominion over this earth, and sin permeates every aspect of this world. Our only chance is a relationship with our Creator, who calls us to walk by faith. That is to walk in a belief in who He is and what promises He has made to us in His Word, regardless of what we see with our eyes. New Testament believers were not listed here, and it would have been viewed as arrogant if Paul was listed here, especially if Paul wrote Hebrews. But the Hall of Faith did not end with the Old Testament. We are challenged to walk with the same faith in which our heroes of the Bible walked before us. That is how we can affect this dark and dying world. God has made promises to us, and while some of those promises involve our lives on this earth, His ultimate promise is in reference to our eternity. With Him forever. Glory. This is Garry Glaub in Mooresville, North Carolina. Have a great day.